to. He was a staff member at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, as well as on the Hill, and he's taught at Georgetown, Harvard, and MIT. Dr. Flank is now a microgrid architect, I have no idea, at Urban Ingenuity, where he oversees microgrid and solar storage projects from start to finish. So for our formal welcome, Ushpizin, here goes. Azamin la sukkah ushpizin ila. I invite to our sukkah our exalted guests. Tivu, tivu, ushpizin mechumadin. Tivu betzila de kuchabrihu. Be seated, honored guests. Be seated in the shadow of the Holy One.
Wow.
Shalom, take it away.
Thank you, Gila. It's wonderful to be with all of you tonight as Ushpizin and Ushpizata, alongside tonight's supernal guests of Yosef and Hulda. It's wonderful to see old friends and new on the screen. I wish you were all in the sukkah with me, or if we could all be together in person, but our next best thing. I have few special claims to expertise in knowing about Jewish physicists. I was a physics major in college long ago. I suppose I also get the boasting rights of having a niece who then went to the same physics program and graduated from the same college as a physics major. But it's been a long time since I've had any professional responsibilities in that realm. Nonetheless, before I get to our featured guest, the warm-up act, I discovered another fellow Yid who also started out in physics, had more of a career than I did, and then had a spectacular career in Yiddishkeit that was unfortunately cut short by his death at age 48. Aryeh Kaplan started out in physics. Who knew? He was a graduate student at the University of Maryland. He published multiple papers in nuclear physics, and yet still had time for publishing almost 50 books, translations, etc., being one of the leading scholars of the 20th century. So some people are just managed to do it all. But tonight I wanted to spend more time inviting into our sukkah Lise Meitner, in part because our societies failed to welcome her in and on so many other occasions during her life. So it seems only fair to welcome her in tonight. She was born in Vienna in 1873, and reading a little bit about her family in Vienna, Jewish family, but very secular, thoroughly integrated into the intellectual life of one of the leading cities on the continent. It was a generation earlier, but it was so easy for me to associate that life with what I've learned about Esther Tickton's upbringing there, Alaha Shalom. She was one of 8 children, and she was one of 4 daughters in the family who eventually wound up earning their PhDs, which just obviously exceptional, but also speaks to the importance of the family in setting the course and the value of education and intellectual endeavors for what she did later in her life. What she did later in her life was not easy, both because she was Jewish and because she was a woman. Being admitted to the University of Vienna, there were very, very few slots that were permitted to women. She had to try multiple times despite her obvious genius. She was finally admitted not on the basis of accomplishments, but because her score on the entrance exams just embarrassed them so much they had to let her in. But at age 23. And she was the first woman admitted to the physics program at the University of Vienna, and the second woman to earn her PhD only 6 years later. At that point, I was talking to somebody earlier this week as I was preparing, and I misspoke. I said that she was invited to the Max Planck Institute in Germany. And some of you may know that there are a series of incredibly prestigious institutions across Germany called the Max Planck Institutes. She was not invited to the Max Planck Institute. She was invited by Max Planck to come and work with him in Berlin at the same time, 1907, the same invitation as Albert Einstein. So she arrived in Berlin in 1907. She was invited by Max Planck. She was not invited to be a staff member or to be paid. She was also not invited into the laboratories. They were concerned that any women in experimental spaces, their hair might catch on fire. That was the excuse for keeping them out of the lab. And reading about this story, it reminds me of my own mother, who I don't need to invite in tonight because she is going to be on the Zoom call with all the 30 cousins tomorrow night in our sukkah. In the 1950s, she met my father as a chemistry major at Temple University. And after graduating, she looked for a job in chemistry. Very difficult for a woman to get a bench job. She was finally called in as a kind of temporary substitute, and the director of the laboratory loved her work and finally offered her a job. When she arrived the following Monday, he approached her clearly embarrassed, not wanting to be the messenger, and saying that he hadn't realized when he offered her the job that she was Jewish, and withdrew the offer. So, and of course, this is not quite 50 years after Lise Meitner, so I can only imagine what she went through in Berlin. But she stuck it out. She was an unpaid research scientist for 6 years at the Berlin Institute for Chemistry. During that time, she collaborated with a chemist, Otto Hahn. Now, at the time, physics and chemistry were a very good match for doing research in the nuclear field, because we were still teasing apart what these substances were. So you needed the chemical techniques to be able to say, oh, this is a different element and these are its properties, but you needed the nuclear physics to be able to explain what was actually going on with radioactivity and what neutrons were. That was all still being discovered at the time. So she and Otto Hahn paired up the chemistry and the physics and made a series of advances in the field together. He, of course, got much recognition. She got much less. She did get some Nobel Prize nominations. As we have learned in the past weeks, nominations can be made by almost anybody, so that's not as big a deal as you might think it is, but still a sign of respect. Let's see, I do have just one picture from this period that I think expresses some of what the field was like at the time. So I'm going to see if I can share my screen. There we go. So that's a picture. It's in Berlin, but it was a group organized by Niels Bohr, who was the hub of physics for some 40 years, and almost anything that happened collaboratively in the field was due to him. So he organized a group of kind of up-and-coming physicists, and no surprise, she is the only woman in this picture. That was the world in which she lived and essentially thrived. I should also mention that during this period, on a visit back home to Vienna, she formally withdrew from the Jewish community in Austria. Right, as Jews in the most advanced European countries like Austria and Denmark, you had to register with your religious community. It was, under the monarch, etc. She withdrew from the Jewish community. She was not exactly invited into any Christian community. And during the rise of Nazism in Germany, she, of course, was still considered Jewish. She was able to continue her research and her work later than some other scientists, right? By 1933, Albert Einstein was on a tour of the U.S., presenting some of his research, etc. He was quite famous by that point. When some of the anti-Jewish laws started being implemented in Germany, he stayed in the U.S. He didn't come back. She was in Berlin, but because she was an Austrian citizen, those laws didn't apply to her until 1938 with the Anschluss, when Austria was formally unified with Germany. At that point, Niels Bohr arranged for another physicist to essentially smuggle her out of the country to the Netherlands, and from there to Copenhagen, which is where the Bohr Institute was, and from there to Sweden, where she spent the war, and much of the post-war period as well. In the midst of all of that upheaval, she was sent some experimental results from Enrico Fermi, one of the most famous physicists of the 20th century. Fermi was bombarding various substances with neutrons in order to produce new elements. If the neutron gets absorbed into the nucleus, it gets converted to a proton and the atomic number increases by 1. If you're bombarding with lots of neutrons, you can have a multi-stage process, and you can kind of push your way up the periodic table. He was trying to go beyond the atomic number of the substance in nature with the highest atomic number, which is uranium. So he was trying to create transuranic substances. He got some results that he didn't understand, and so he sent them around to colleagues around Europe, including, of course, Lise Meitner, who was one of the acknowledged experts in this field, and also her collaborator, Otto Hahn, again, the chemist and the physicist. So what they eventually came to understand, and where Otto Hahn was able to replicate in his laboratory, she, of course, at this point didn't have access to a library, or a library for that matter, only her own brain. Was essentially all the apparatus she was left with. So Otto Hahn replicated some of the experiments, did some of the chemical separation, and realized that what Fermi had produced was not a transuranic, instead a substance with a much lower atomic number, barium, which was a mystery. How could that have happened? So Lise Meitner, in collaboration with her nephew, Otto Frisch, who was also a physicist, just, sitting at like picnics in the outdoors, again, this is her laboratory facility, realized that they could use Niels Bohr, once again, his theory of the structure of the nucleus as a kind of liquid drop. And that what was happening was that when this neutron was added to the unstable nucleus of uranium, that the drop was deformed enough to separate. That what was happening is what we now call nuclear fission. But nobody envisioned before her that that could happen. And she, in fact, borrowed the term of fission from biology, what cells do when they reproduce. It had never been applied in the context of physics before her. Now, what usually happens with these kinds of discoveries in physics is that you name the process after the discoverer, right? So really, we shouldn't call it nuclear fission. We should call it the Meitner process or something like that. Maybe because she was a woman, that didn't happen. And in fact, when the Nobel Prize Committee eventually awarded a prize for the discovery of nuclear fission, it went to the chemists. It went to Otto Hahn. She was left out. She was not invited in. Many years later, she did get the U.S. Fermi Prize, which is the highest prize in physics that the U.S. offers in recognition of that work. But she was never awarded a Nobel. She never returned to Germany. She was invited back after the war, but wanted to have nothing to do with Germany at that point. She mostly stayed in Sweden. Very late in life, moved to the UK to be with her nephew, Otto Frisch. She toward the end of her life, she lived till 1968. So she lived into her late 80s and all the way to 90. In her 80s, she did start to receive some of that recognition that had been denied to her in an earlier era. The 1960s were an era for welcoming people in that had not been previously. So she did get some of that recognition while she was still alive, and I'm very happy to be able to give her a little of that now many decades after her death, and to welcome Lise Meitner into all of our respective sukkahs. Hila, you're muted.
Thank you so much, Shalom. That was just wonderful. And I knew you would be able to make sense of what she actually accomplished, because it wasn't going to be anything I could do, but so fascinating. Thank you for finding her and bringing her in. And I'm wondering if anybody has any questions to raise. I know it's a little daunting to ask questions about physicists.
I have a question, but it's not a physics question.
Go for it, David.
Shalom, can you say a little bit more about what she did during the war? Because, I mean, obviously nuclear fission ended up being fairly consequential, and Hahn stayed in Germany and worked on it. She apparently didn't join others. I mean, she wasn't in the U.S. warning about the bomb. What was she doing, and how did she think through what she had wrought?
So two answers to that question. One is that when she was in Sweden, she was invited to come to a research institute there as well. And once again, the invitation did not include being paid. So she was kind of on the outside looking in professionally yet again. And just needed to find means of supporting herself, which didn't really enable her to continue her research. At the same time, she also, and wrote about this, she made the conscious decision that she did not want to work on weapons projects. She did not want to apply her expertise to that realm, whether for the Allies or certainly not for Germany. Now, one of her students that had studied nuclear physics with her in Berlin in the 1930s was Leo Szilard, whose name may be familiar to some of you. Leo Szilard, spelled S-Z-I-L-A-R-D, another Jewish physicist. And taking her insights about how fission worked and about this neutron coming in and destabilizing the nucleus so that it would undergo fission or undergo the Meitner process, he realized that some fission processes would also release neutrons themselves, which could then be absorbed into another nucleus, causing it to split, and that if more than one neutron were released in that process, it could become a chain reaction, and a very fast chain reaction, And it was his realization of this, kind of walking down the street at an intersection in the center of London as he was about to step off a curb and almost broke his neck in the process as a result, that flash of insight. That chain reaction is, of course, what happens in a nuclear bomb.
And Szilard is the person who actually drafted the letter that Einstein sent to Roosevelt warning that the Germans could be developing this.
Right. And Szilard, after the war and after being a key part of the Manhattan Project, reached the same conclusion as his teacher, as Lise Meitner, and decided he did not want to participate in weapons research and became one of the organizers of the physics community, both to refrain from the research and also to try to institute some form of control over these horrific weapons that they had invented. And David, you can probably give more of that history if you'd like.
Nope.
Wow. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Is there one more question or yes, anybody? All right. So I'm going to invite Chazan Ramon to lead us in a song. And
so sure. I was thinking that very soon we're going to be asking for rain, whether you can believe it or not. And so what comes here, I'm going to try to have it for you. There you go. It's a song called Leshoni Konanta. Is a yotzer, is a prayer that introduces the Amidah. And the translation says, my tongue you have fashioned or made wise, depending whether this was Leshoni Konanta or Leshoni Bonanta. And my God, and I've chosen songs that you have placed in my mouth. They are better than any other discourse. And my footsteps you have directed toward you from the first. And you have given me a throat that has not gone dry from calling out to you. And you have purified my yetzer, my instinct, to be as white as wool. Therefore my heart did not stray nor grow dizzy within me. Be now my protector as yesterday and tomorrow. You are my shield, my God. Do not delay. And the music comes from a Ladino song that I will sing for you at another time. And it goes like this. Leshoni konanta Elohai vativcha Veshirim shesamta Vefi tov mimizrach Venegdach Sing with me. Ya la 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 ya la 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 I think it's a good way to bring rain in. Thank you very much, everybody. And I think I like to take just a minute to tell you about the taste that we're going to have tomorrow evening. I see her here, Karen Lantner. And so Karen will invite artist Marc Chagall into our virtual sukkah as an honor guest. And Karen is a prize-winning figurative realist artist based in Rockville. And I will not tell you any more than that, except to say that at 6:30 tomorrow evening, we're going to have our last of our Ushpizin evenings. And hopefully with the pictures and the spirit of Chagall is going to take us to Shabbat and to Shmini Atzeret and to Simchat Torah. And with that, we're going to conclude this arch that once began, I wanted to say on Slichot, but it really began before then, all the way from Tisha B'Av, if you remember Rabbi Gila, all the way to Tu B'Av, and then to the 40 days of Selichot, and then of course Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. And so I invite you, B'samachta b'chagecha, I invite you to continue rejoicing in this Hag that is called Hechag, the one holiday, right? Doesn't get it very much press, but it should. It should. So with that, I think, since that's in my clock, it says 7 o'clock, we're going to tell you Laila Tov. Have a really good rest of the evening and get all that energy to come back tomorrow to listen to Karen tell us about Marc Chagall as our last Ushpizin guest. And and before even then, I wanted to say to Shalom that you remind me of those words, Apores Sukat Shalom. So thank you for bringing that too to us, to spread more of that beautiful knowledge that you, with such simplicity, you're able to give. Let's not be confused. What Shalom does is not something that is so easy to do. It looks easy, but it's enormously complex. So thank you so much for being part of this Shirat HaNefesh family for tonight. And may you also have a Chag Sameach, Muadim Lesimcha, and with the words of Cliff Braverman, fascinating. Thanks so much.
Shalom.
So, Laila Tov, everybody. May you all be well.
Fabulous.
Thank you.
Laila Tov.
Amen.
Thank you.